stop trying to add more to your spiritual practice. Right now, you're probably meditating longer, reading more books, attending more workshops, and collecting more spiritual tools, thinking that accumulation equals awakening. But Carl Gustav Jung discovered something that completely contradicts everything the spiritual industry teaches you. Real awakening isn't about adding anything to who you are. It's about slowly, painfully, deliberately quitting the very things that make you feel safe, validated, and special. Jung spent decades studying human consciousness and discovered that genuine spiritual transformation happens through subtraction, not addition. The people who experience real awakening aren't the ones who've mastered the most techniques or achieved the highest states. They're the ones who've had the courage to release the psychological crutches that most people cling to for their entire lives. Today, I'm going to reveal the 7 specific things that spiritually awakening people gradually quit, based on Jung's revolutionary insights into human psychology. This isn't comfortable information. It will challenge everything you believe about your spiritual journey and force you to confront the ways you've been performing spirituality rather than living it. But before we dive into these life-changing insights, if you're ready to understand the real psychology of spiritual awakening beyond surface-level teachings and Instagram spirituality, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to explore will separate those who are genuinely committed to transformation from those who are simply collecting spiritual experiences. The first thing spiritually awake people slowly quit is the hunger for approval. This isn't just about wanting people to like you. It's a much deeper psychological dependency that Jung called the persona trap. Before awakening begins, most people construct their entire identity around receiving validation from external sources. They make decisions based on what will earn approval, shape their personality to fit social expectations, and measure their worth by how others respond to them. Jung understood that this approval addiction serves a crucial function in ordinary consciousness. It helps you feel safe in the collective, connected to the tribe, and certain of your value in the world. But this safety comes at an enormous cost: the complete abandonment of your authentic self. You become what Jung termed a puppet of the collective unconscious, living out scripts written by societal conditioning rather than your own soul's blueprint. As awakening begins, something shifts. You start noticing the exhaustion of constant performance, the emptiness of approval that never truly satisfies, and the prison of shaping yourself to meet others' expectations. This isn't a sudden revelation. It's a slow, gradual recognition that becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to see how much energy you've been expending to maintain an image that isn't even real. The quitting process is excruciating because approval has been your primary source of psychological security. When you start releasing this need, you feel naked, vulnerable, and terrifyingly uncertain about who you are without external validation. Jung called this the dissolution of the persona, the death of your social mask, and the birth of something more authentic underneath. The second thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the need to be special. This might be the most difficult pattern to recognize because it disguises itself as spiritual seeking itself. Jung discovered that many people pursue awakening not to transcend the ego, but to create what he called the inflated ego, a spiritualized version of superiority that's even more insidious than ordinary narcissism. The need to be special manifests in countless ways on the spiritual path. You collect experiences, insights, and abilities that prove you're different from ordinary people. You pride yourself on seeing what others can't see, knowing what others don't know, or having access to spiritual dimensions that others haven't reached. You might position yourself as the wounded healer, the chosen one, the awakened being in a world of sleepers. Jung understood this pattern intimately because he struggled with it himself during his own psychological crisis. He recognized that the psyche has a powerful drive toward what he called individuation, becoming a unique individual. But this drive can be hijacked by the ego and turned into spiritual narcissism. The ego takes the legitimate longing to fulfill your unique purpose and corrupts it into a need to be better than, more evolved than, or more special than others. What makes this pattern so difficult to quit is that it provides enormous psychological rewards. Being special gives you a sense of significance in a vast, indifferent universe. It protects you from the terror of ordinariness, the fear of being just another human among billions. It provides a narrative that makes your suffering meaningful and your struggles heroic. As genuine awakening deepens, you begin to see through this need for specialness. You recognize that your spiritual experiences, insights, and abilities don't make you superior. They make you more responsible. You understand that everyone is walking their own path of awakening, and yours isn't more important or more advanced than anyone else's. You stop comparing your inner journey to others' external presentations. The quitting process involves a profound humbling. You realize that you're not the chosen one. Everyone is chosen. You're not uniquely wounded. Everyone carries trauma. You're not specially gifted. Everyone has access to the same consciousness. This recognition doesn't diminish your worth. Paradoxically, it reveals your true value. Jung called this the psychological descent, the willingness to become ordinary in service of becoming genuinely authentic. What emerges after releasing the need to be special is what Jung termed true individuation, becoming uniquely yourself, not because you're better than others, but because you're finally real. Your uniqueness stops being a defensive strategy against ordinariness and becomes a natural expression of your authentic being. The third thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the performance of happiness. This is perhaps the most socially reinforced pattern because our entire culture is built on the idea that happiness is the ultimate goal and that displaying positivity is a moral virtue. But Jung discovered that this relentless pursuit and performance of happiness is actually a defense mechanism against the deeper, more authentic experiences of being human. Before awakening, most people believe that spiritual growth should make them happier, more positive, and more peaceful. They use spiritual practices as tools to manage their emotional state, trying to transcend negative feelings and cultivate positive ones. They post inspirational quotes, share gratitude lists, and present a curated version of their spiritual journey that emphasizes light while hiding shadow. Jung called this the one-sidedness problem. When we identify exclusively with happiness and positivity, we create what he termed the shadow. All the rejected, denied, and suppressed aspects of our experience that don't fit the happy narrative. This shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It grows stronger in the unconscious and eventually erupts in unexpected and often destructive ways. As genuine awakening unfolds, you begin to recognize the exhaustion of constantly performing happiness. You notice how much energy it takes to maintain the positive facade, how inauthentic it feels to post about gratitude when you're actually struggling, and how isolating it is to pretend everything is fine when it isn't. You start to understand that real spiritual maturity includes the capacity to be with all of your experience, not just the pleasant parts. The quitting process means allowing yourself to feel and express the full spectrum of human emotion without judgment or spiritual bypassing. It means admitting when you're angry and then confused or struggling without immediately trying to fix it or transform it into a lesson. It means dropping the exhausting performance of having it all together and showing up as genuinely human. Jung believed that wholeness, not happiness, is the true goal of psychological and spiritual development. Wholeness includes joy, and sorrow, light and dark, clarity and confusion. When you quit performing happiness, you discover something far more valuable: genuine presence with whatever is actually arising in your experience. This doesn't mean becoming negative or pessimistic. It means developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing emotional states without being overwhelmed by them or collapsing into one side. You can feel deep sadness and still access gratitude. You can experience anger and still maintain compassion. You become psychologically sophisticated rather than spiritually naive. What emerges after releasing the performance of happiness is authentic joy, not the forced positivity of spiritual bypassing, but the organic aliveness that comes from being fully present with reality as it is. This joy includes suffering, embraces difficulty, and doesn't depend on circumstances being pleasant. The fourth thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the safety of certainty. This pattern runs deeper than most people realize because certainty feels like wisdom, and the spiritual path is supposed to bring clarity and understanding. But Jung discovered that clinging to certainty is actually a defense against the profound mystery of existence and the psychological terror of not knowing. Before awakening deepens, most people use spiritual teachings as a way to create certainty in an uncertain world. They collect answers, adopt belief systems, and construct rigid frameworks that explain everything from karma to cosmic purpose. They know exactly how the universe works, what happens after death, and why things happen the way they do. This certainty provides enormous psychological comfort in a chaotic, unpredictable reality. Jung understood this need for certainty intimately, but he also recognized it as a form of psychological imprisonment. He wrote extensively about what he called living in the question, the capacity to remain open to mystery without collapsing into premature answers or convenient explanations. He discovered that real wisdom isn't about knowing more. It's about becoming comfortable with not knowing. The spiritual ego loves certainty because it creates the illusion of control and mastery. When you're certain about how things work, you can position yourself as an authority, teach others, and feel secure in your understanding. But this certainty closes you off from genuine discovery, from the humility of being a perpetual student, and from the awe of encountering mystery that exceeds your comprehension. As awakening matures, you begin to notice how your need for certainty has been limiting your growth. You recognize that your most profound insights often came from moments of complete confusion and not knowing. You see how clinging to spiritual explanations has sometimes prevented you from sitting with the raw reality of experiences that defy explanation. The quitting process involves a radical opening to uncertainty that can feel terrifying. You start releasing your grip on the spiritual frameworks that have been organizing your reality. You admit that you don't actually know why suffering exists, what consciousness is, or what your purpose might be. You stop pretending to have answers when you don't, and become willing to say, "I don't know," without shame. Jung called this psychological state the cloud of unknowing, a medieval mystical term he adopted to describe the mature spiritual stance of remaining open to mystery. This isn't ignorance or intellectual laziness. It's the sophisticated recognition that reality is infinitely more complex, paradoxical, and mysterious than any belief system can capture. What's particularly challenging about quitting certainty is that it removes one of your primary tools for managing anxiety. Certainty has been your defense against existential fear, your protection against the vertigo of living in an ultimately unknowable universe. Without it, you feel vulnerable and exposed to the full weight of existence. But what emerges after releasing the need for certainty is something Jung called living wisdom, knowledge that comes from direct experience rather than borrowed beliefs, understanding that evolves rather than calcifies, and insight that remains open to revision and deepening. The fifth thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the comfort of blame. This might be the most psychologically challenging pattern to release because blame serves such a powerful function in protecting the ego from pain and responsibility. Jung discovered that as long as we can blame someone or something else for our suffering, we avoid the terrifying recognition of our own role in creating our reality. Before awakening matures, Most people operate within what Jung called the victim-persecutor-rescuer triangle. When things go wrong, they immediately locate an external cause: their parents, their partner, their boss, society, the patriarchy, their past trauma, or even the universe itself. This blame provides psychological relief because it means their suffering isn't their fault, and they don't have to change anything fundamental about themselves. The spiritual version of blame is even more insidious because it disguises itself as insight. You blame your childhood for your relationship patterns, your past lives for your current struggles, your astrological chart for your personality limitations, or your family karma for your suffering. These explanations feel sophisticated and psychologically informed, but they still serve the same function. They let you off the hook for radical self-responsibility. Jung understood that blame is deeply seductive because it preserves the ego's innocence while explaining our pain. It allows us to remain psychologically passive, waiting for others to change, or for external circumstances to improve before we can be whole. It creates what he termed the neurotic deadlock, a psychological stalemate where growth becomes impossible because everything is someone else's fault. As genuine awakening deepens, you begin to see through the comfort of blame. You recognize that while your past experiences shaped you, they don't define you. You understand that while others may have harmed you, continuing to blame them only keeps you trapped in victim consciousness. You realize that every moment you spend blaming is a moment you're not spending on actual transformation. The quitting process is agonizing because it requires what Jung called radical responsibility. The willingness to own your role in every situation, every relationship, every pattern, and every outcome. This doesn't mean blaming yourself instead of others. It means moving beyond the entire blame paradigm into a more mature psychological stance. Radical responsibility means recognizing that even when you've been genuinely victimized, you still have agency in how you respond and what meaning you create from the experience. It means understanding that your healing isn't dependent on others acknowledging their harm or making amends. It means accepting that you are the primary author of your life story, not a character in someone else's narrative. If you're still watching and absorbing these challenging truths about the spiritual path, you're clearly committed to real transformation rather than comfortable illusions. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going to continue exploring the psychological depths that most spiritual teachers avoid. Your awakening depends on understanding these uncomfortable realities. What emerges after releasing blame is what Jung called psychological adulthood, the capacity to meet life on its own terms without requiring it to be fair, just, or kind. You stop waiting for apologies, for recognition, or for circumstances to change before you can move forward. The sixth thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the luxury of spiritual bypassing. Jung didn't use this exact term, but he understood the phenomenon deeply. The tendency to use spiritual concepts and practices to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological wounds, uncomfortable emotions, and challenging interpersonal dynamics. This might be the most prevalent pattern in modern spirituality and the most difficult to recognize in yourself. Spiritual bypassing shows up in countless ways. You use meditation to avoid feeling your anger. You invoke concepts like everything happens for a reason to bypass grief. You talk about forgiveness to avoid setting boundaries. You focus on raising your vibration instead of addressing your relationship problems. You preach about oneness while avoiding genuine intimacy. You cultivate detachment to escape accountability. Jung would identify this as what he called the transcendent defense, using higher consciousness as a way to escape lower consciousness rather than integrating it. He understood that real psychological development requires what he termed descensus ad inferos, the descent into hell, the willingness to go down into the messy, painful, uncomfortable depths of human experience before you can genuinely transcend them. The problem with spiritual bypassing is that it looks and feels like spiritual progress. you're meditating daily, reading spiritual texts, attending workshops, and using all the right language. But underneath the spiritual performance, the original wounds remain unhealed. The difficult emotions stay suppressed, and the behavioral patterns continue unchanged. You've built a beautiful spiritual structure on a foundation of unprocessed pain. As awakening becomes more authentic, you begin to see through your own bypassing strategies. You recognize the moments when you're using spiritual concepts to avoid difficult conversations, uncomfortable feelings, or necessary confrontations. You notice how you've been transcending instead of integrating, ascending instead of descending, spiritualizing instead of humanizing. The quitting process requires what Jung called the integration of the shadow, the willingness to bring everything you've been avoiding into conscious awareness and work with it directly. This means feeling your anger fully instead of immediately forgiving. It means grieving your losses completely instead of finding silver linings. It means expressing your needs clearly instead of pretending you're beyond needing anything. This integration work is messy, unglamorous, and deeply humbling. It often requires therapy, honest conversations, boundary setting, and confronting people and patterns you've been avoiding. It means admitting that despite all your spiritual work, you're still human with human needs, human wounds, and human limitations. Jung believed that spiritual development without psychological development creates what he called the inflated personality, someone who identifies with transcendent states while their actual human personality remains immature and undeveloped. Real awakening requires both the ascent into higher consciousness and the descent into psychological wholeness. The final thing spiritually awake people gradually quit is the isolation of being awake. Many people on the spiritual path begin to identify so strongly with their awakening that they separate themselves from ordinary human connection and collective life. They position themselves as observers rather than participants. As beings of light surrounded by darkness, as conscious individuals in a world of sleepers. Jung warned against this pattern, calling it the hermit complex, the tendency to withdraw from human connection in the name of spiritual purity or consciousness preservation. While periods of solitude and retreat are necessary for inner work, using awakening as justification for permanent isolation is a form of spiritual immaturity disguised as enlightened detachment. The isolation of being awake manifests in subtle ways. You stop engaging genuinely with people who aren't on a spiritual path, viewing them as unconscious or unevolving. You avoid ordinary activities because they seem trivial compared to your spiritual pursuits. You struggle to maintain friendships with anyone who doesn't understand your awakening journey. You feel superior to or separate from collective human experience. Jung understood that genuine individuation, becoming truly yourself, doesn't separate you from humanity. It connects you more deeply to the human condition. He believed that the goal of psychological and spiritual work isn't to transcend being human, but to become more fully human, to embrace what he called embodied consciousness, awareness that lives through ordinary human experience rather than above it. As awakening matures, you begin to recognize the loneliness and arrogance hidden within spiritual isolation. You understand that your awakening isn't meant to separate you from others, but to help you engage more authentically with all of life. You realize that viewing yourself as awake while others sleep is itself a form of unconsciousness, the ego's final attempt to maintain specialness through spiritual identity. The quitting process involves what Jung termed the return to the collective, bringing your awakened consciousness back into ordinary human relationship and activity. This means engaging genuinely with people at whatever level of awareness they're at, without judgment or condescension. It means participating in mundane life with full presence rather than spiritual superiority. It means using your awareness to serve rather than separate. This return is challenging because it requires releasing the identity of being special, awakened, or different. It demands that you find your place within human community rather than above it. It asks you to bring your gifts and insights into the world without needing recognition for your spiritual status. What ultimately emerges from quitting all 7 of these patterns: approval hunger, the need to be special, happiness performance, certainty addiction, comfortable blame, spiritual bypassing, and awakened isolation, is what Jung called the individuated self. This isn't a fixed achievement or final state. It's an ongoing process of becoming more authentically human while remaining connected to consciousness itself. Real awakening, according to Jung, produces people who are simultaneously more ordinary and more extraordinary. More ordinary because they've released all the spiritual performance and pretense. More extraordinary because they embody genuine authenticity, radical responsibility, and conscious connection. They've quit everything that kept them safe and comfortable to become what they were always meant to be: fully human and fully awake at the same time.